Welcome back. I'm in the studio with Kanthan Pillay, a former top executive in media circles, as I indicated, also the top honcho of this particular channel. And good to have you with us, Kanthan. Let's talk about your personal journey in the media, which includes other parts, like technology, for instance. You were exposed to it much earlier on.
I think that was a happy accident, and I think I have to really blame apartheid for that, because 1986, with the state of emergency, I, like many other people, left the country because it was a bad time for journalists. We were all getting locked up left, right, and center, and I left and went to the United States, where I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to Princeton, and ended up studying there, and got myself a part-time job at the computer center, and discovered my first Apple Macintosh with a laser printer. And you know, for most of us in this country during the apartheid years, we put out community newspapers, or probably what the Nats would have called propaganda newspapers, but essentially we would go through the process of setting up a printing press and put out our first edition, and then the security branch would come in and confiscate it. And I saw this Apple Mac and a laser printer, and I said, my word, if we had these back home and we distributed this around the country, we would be able to produce a quick knock and drop, and then put in the back of someone's trunk and move it elsewhere. And so I was drawn to study this technology just on the basis of what can we do with this that's actually going to make us better at journalism. And from that, it was a question of needing to solve problems around, well, how do you scale this to produce proper newspapers? Because we didn't have desktop publishing systems at the time, and so I kept studying.
But did you, I mean, over time, studying from there, did you have a sense that technology will have such an impact on media? I mean, when you look at it now, today, where we are?
I was able to see lots of the entry points to it at the time. The immediate piece of technology that we had that immediately grabbed my attention was email back then. You know, imagine in 1986, and I discovered that you can actually have near instant communication around the world. Then there was also something which was called Usenet, which still exists to this day. These days it's mainly used for piracy of movies and that type of thing. But back in the day, it was a network where people shared news and information, and it was before we had interactive things like web browsers and so forth. But one could already see that the technology was moving things in a direction where dissemination of information was not going to be waiting for a newspaper to be dropped onto your doorstep in the morning.
But now, you know, then in time with the opening up of South Africa, the new regulations, new licenses being issued, you saw the introduction of new players and the emergence of other media. You know, just to give me a broad sweep of your experience over that period of time.
We're talking about post-94?
Post-94, yeah.
Well, obviously the opening up of the broadcast media was the single most significant thing. So first there was the privatization of the former regional stations such as Highveld and East Coast Radio and so forth. And then, of course, the major step was ETV itself, which I was part of the startup team in 1998. And of course, we completely turned the world upside down. You might remember San Reddy and Jane Dutton used to sit on the desk to read the news back then. And so it became a very conversational form of storytelling.
It's a coming back home of sorts for Jane Dutton now.
It is, very much so, because she was part of the team back then. But also the way in which we began telling stories on television. There was this whole concept of the Johnny, which is you tell the story from the perspective of one player in it, which immediately gave ETV's news that very personal touch and made it very accessible. And of course, it became one of the major success stories. But of course, the growth came in terms of the World Wide Web, and as soon as web browsers became accessible, you suddenly had access to information from around the world, which you didn't previously had. So suddenly you had a situation where you have the Star and the Cape Times and the Natal Mercury, which used to be staples, but now they're competing with the New York Times. They're competing with the South China Morning Post. They're competing with India Today. And this turned our world upside down.
Yeah, and then you went on to go into music, the music station YFM. So, and when you contrast the newspaper environment, the television news environment, and then the music environment, particularly that which focuses on youth.
Well, I think in the case of YFM, there were a number of things that I did at YFM that took it out of just a music-only environment. For example, news was viewed at YFM as an obligation in terms of licensing. So there were only 3 people on the news team at the time. And I very quickly expanded that to about 13 people. We started doing bulletins on the weekend as well. We introduced current affairs shows. We introduced business shows. And again, the whole idea was that the fact that you have a young audience doesn't mean that they don't want to be informed. But they need to be informed in language that actually speaks to them. They need to be informed by presenters who are part of their age group, and topics that appeal to them. And I think that that was hugely successful. We introduced, I designed a particular package with the BBC in London called BBC Minute, where I told them what I'm looking for is a snapshot of news around the world in a minute that can run on a 24-hour basis. And we sat and designed that together, and it's become one of their biggest properties.
And then it generated audiences, obviously. And
well, it generated audiences for them around the world.
Yeah.
And what was interesting, when I designed this, they were going to give this to me for nothing. And I said, no, I'm going to pay you for it. And they said, why? I said, because if I pay you for it, then I can tell you what to do.
Yes.
If I'm getting it as a freebie, I can't tell you what to do.
But you know, we've touched on some of the things that may make people doubt the media, right? And do you still believe that it's a source for good, that the media can play a constructive role in the development of a society?
I think more so than ever. And I think, again, you know, using the Sunday Times as an example, I do believe that the audience wants to give media the benefit of the doubt. And studies have shown this over time, that if the best thing that you can do, irrespective of whatever media, if you admit to your mistakes immediately and at the same level as you made the mistake, people say, I appreciate that. Well done. And I trust you, and I'm going to continue. But if you have something that's a front page headline, and then you put an apology in small print on page 2 and say an error occurred in editing, people don't like that.
But let me talk about training then, and the education, in training in the media as well as generally education in our society. You've got strong views about education, right? I can see from your postings that you feel strongly, and you wade in whenever there's a debate about it. But let's start first with the influence you could bring to bear in terms of the training of journalists and other media professionals.
I think training has to be an integral part of every news operation, and it has to be driven from the top. I think what has been the pattern for much of the print media is they take people on as interns, but in fact they are cheap labor. Interns need to be people who are learning, not part of the people who are actually doing the news gathering. You train the interns so that they actually understand the essence of what you as an organization are all about, and then you cherry pick from them in terms of hiring them. But that training process has to be an integral part of the operation. The Y Academy, for example, is still running now after I've left more than, I started that 10 years ago. Every 6 months without fail, it takes on 12 youngsters.
Before we end the show, I'd like to pick your brain on what you think about the state of education in the country. Tomorrow I've got a bigger interview, more involved with Professor Jonathan Jansen on education. But give me your thoughts.
Education in this country has to be stripped down, torn apart. The current system cannot be reformed. Our teachers are a disaster. The structures are a disaster. It's dependent on bricks and mortar. It has to be digital. It has to be also at the level of mother tongue instruction for early childhood development especially, because you can't be teaching concepts that kids cannot relate to if it's not their mother tongue. And it has to be also time shifted, because we can't have the situation where people are waiting for a teacher to teach them lessons in class. The pattern needs to shift. The lectures need to be delivered at home, preferably by a video, and then the homework needs to get done in the classroom under the teacher's supervision. Right now we do it the other way around. So that way, parents are able to supervise their kids and ensure that they are watching the video. Right now, if a parent doesn't understand what the homework is all about, the kid can actually give them the runaround. But if the parent has a schedule that says this child on this particular day has to spend an hour watching this particular lecture, then the parent is able to supervise that, or the grandparent, or the primary.
Well, you've raised some of these things. A very brief response from you. Do you feel like you're whistling in the wind, or is there anyone listening out there?
No, I don't think so. I think that there are changes happening in terms of teaching methods. It's happening primarily in private schools. And again, that's because the state has a monopoly on education. And until such time as we get to the point where parents are actually empowered. I'm saying if you have a non-performing school in a township, we spend an average of about 20,000 rand per child. Give that money to the parents.
Yes.
Let them then take this child, top up the money if they want to, but put the child into a private school where the child can actually bloom.
Okay.
That model has to change.
Kanthan Pillay, calling for some revolutionary changes out there in the education space. I appreciate your time. And of course, people follow you on Twitter. It's at Kanthan Pillay.
It's Kanthan Pillay on Twitter.
Thank you very much for having been our guest. And in a short while, I will be focusing on ASCOM. And I will be talking to the former executive, Marcelo Koko, who's going to be with me in a moment. Don't go away. And of course, the conversation continues on Twitter at #the Modise Network.